Welcome everyone to today's program for GSHASC. Our program title is Native Bound-Unbound, Peopling the Archive of Indigenous Slavery. And our honored speaker is Dr. Esteban Rael-Gálvez. I'm going to give you a brief description of the program before Dr. Gálvez speaks. Building upon decades of research by Dr. Rael-Gálvez on Native American slavery, thanks to the Mellon Foundation, he has been able to launch Native Bound-Unbound, Archive of Indigenous Slavery, the object of which is to create a centralized digital repository centered on the lives of the enslaved Indigenous people across the Americas. Dr. Rael-Gálvez will provide an overview of the initiative and engage the audience in a conversation about how to get involved. Anthropologist, historian, and cultural consultant, Dr. Esteban Rael-Gálvez has served as the former senior vice president at the National Trust for Historic Preservation, executive director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and as the state historian of New Mexico. He is currently the executive director of Native Bound-Unbound. A native son of New Mexico, he received his BA in English Literature and Ethnic Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MA and PhD in American Cultures from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where he completed his dissertation, Identifying Captivity and Capturing Identity, the basis of a book project. And now I'm honored to present Dr. Esteban Rael-Gálvez.
Karen, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me, both on Zoom and in person. And Kathy, I presume that my PowerPoint is visible.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I always, particularly with a group like this, whose very essence is about honoring ancestors, I always like to start there. I grew up with grandmothers and friends who always invoked a prayer or a saying or an acknowledgement before you tell a story. It's important to acknowledge the ground beneath us. For me, it's always important to acknowledge, as I was taught to say, the breath of our ancestors is always around us. I like invoking breath because it's life force, right? Our ability to breathe, and particularly in a moment when it's been so difficult for people to breathe, COVID and everything else. And so for me, it's also an acknowledgement that our ancestors continue to surround us, be with us. And that very breath gives us breath and reminds us that whatever we say, whatever we do, the breath life force that we give out on a daily basis is actually, it's about the next generations that follow us. So of course, this is something that your society understands so well, because you honor your ancestors in the work that you do. Let's see if I can switch here. For me, every story has an origin story. It begins somewhere. And I just want to spend a few moments today before I jump into the actual project that I want to share with you. And then, as Karen said, I want to have a conversation. I want to say a little bit about where this story for me began. Come on, there we go.
Yeah.
I've long since acknowledged the power of place in all of the work that I've always done. So I was fortunate to be raised in a magnificent landscape, even if it was very stark. So I grew up right on the state line of Colorado and New Mexico, in a village known as Costilla. And I grew up herding sheep and irrigating and all of those things I was actually very bad at. So as I think my dad would, as I would kid with my dad, I used to lose the sheep and lose the water. I don't think that's entirely true, but I certainly very much what I did gain there, if I didn't lose anything, was my core values. But I also understood very deeply by just opening my eyes and looking in around me was not only the built environment that had shaped who I was and my ancestors and how I thought about myself, how I was being, the stories that were being invoked about myself. So it was that built environment, in some cases, structures that were thousands of years old, in some cases, hundreds. I was able to grow up in part in my grandparents' ancestral home in a village known today as Cuesta, but was settled as San Antonio del Rio Colorado. In a home that had been built by my grandparents, who were all of my grandparents were born in the late 1800s. And so, but I was also surrounded by the natural landscape. So on this photo at the left, this is in Costilla, that mountain was known as Montaña de la Yuta, Ute Mountain. So I knew that, like, just the landscape had stories to tell of people that were once there, their homeland, and perhaps how those people, at least some of them, had become part of that village as well. And of course, if I turned in a different direction, away from looking directly at Ute Mountain and just turned directly to look north, I could see what is known as White Shell Mountain, known by some as Montaña Blanca, Mount Blanca, which is one of the 4 sacred mountains that defines the Dene homeland, the Navajo homeland. And so literally wherever I was, where I was growing up, I could see these 2 mountains. And then if I turned back around, I could see what are known as the Sangre de Cristos. So all of this shaped how I started to think about myself. But I was raised, as I like to say, and is entirely true, by at least 3 stories that have shaped this work that I continue to do today. I think most of you will recall that moment was in 1976, I think, or 7, when Alex Haley's novel had been syndicated, been made into a syndicated television series, Roots. That was a moment unlike the one that we're living in, when there was like 4 channels, not a bazillion channels, right? And families actually sat down together to watch TV, and there wasn't the distractions that we have with cell phones and everything else. And so we sat down night after night as that series was playing, and it deeply, deeply influenced me. Roots, I think we haven't fully acknowledged as a society the impact that series had. To have African Americans be able to not only see, but to tell their own stories, right? The 1970s were, having emerged from the 1960s, meant that there were still very, very few African American professors gathering and telling their own stories, writing their own stories. The publishing industry was really not publishing many of those. And unfortunately, that continues to remain, the needle hasn't changed that much. But this moment was important because suddenly you had a story about ancestry, and it being syndicated on television, and you had half of the American public half of the American public, according to statistics, tuned in to watch Roots. That's pretty amazing. Now, half of the American public doesn't tune in to watch almost anything these days. It's because it's so bifurcated across channels. And so it changed how we thought and think about race, how we thought about legacy, ancestry, and certainly how we thought about slavery. And so I was a 9-10-year-old little boy watching this series. To this day, I can recite lines from Roots. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but it was so became part of how I thought of things that I could tell you who Chicken George was, who Kizzy, all of these individuals. I was also being, at that very moment, maybe why it influenced me, I was also being told two other stories. Every time we visited my great-grandmother, Dulcinea Arellano, she told the same story, and her sisters told the same stories to all of their descendants of La India Panana, the Pawnee woman who had been captured, as she would say, pursing her lips to point down south. She had been captured by another group. She didn't know this by who. And another man had been captured. Sometimes she said he was Spanish. Sometimes she said he was Mexican. And she told that man, if you take me with you, I will show you how to escape. And escape they did. And they ended up in Arroyo Hondo, which is just north of Taos. And I descend from that couple. I didn't know then what a panana was. It's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It is, for those of you who may still not know, though I bet you do, is Pawnee. But I would then have to eventually find her name and do all the work that you know how to do, is to excavate through records. The other story that was been told was always accompanied by pointing to one of two blankets, including this blanket that you see on the screen. It was attributed to a woman that was referred to, at least she was given a name, Nanacela Manuelita Cisneros, who had been captured and taken as a little girl into a Abiquiu family, and she became the matriarch of all of the Rael family. Many of you, I think, relate to Abiquiu, and I like to think that Abiquiu was one of those. It was one of those center points, but it became sort of the ancestor of my home village of Cuesta, and most of the people that settled in Cuesta came from Abiquiu. And so she was the matriarch that did not come, but her son and her grandchildren all came and settled Cuesta. And this was a blanket that she, according to the stories, she wove. So I was raised with those three stories: Roots, La India Panana, and the Dene woman who had been captured. So but I knew that my stories could not be unique, even though I think they were unique in that I had grandmothers who were willing to tell these stories, who were willing to talk about a more complex ancestry. As a consequence, I was so interested in this. I hope that doesn't bode well. Okay. I was so interested in this that I went on to write a doctoral dissertation about Native slavery. I was interested particularly in post-1848, where because I was interested in the American period in New Mexico and Colorado for how we dealt with this other slavery. And I had found several documents while I was doing research everywhere, but certainly at the National Archives, including this first page of an incredible document that was penned by a man by the name of Lafayette Head. Andrew Johnson, of all people, who was the president that followed President Lincoln, he asked all Indian agents in the territories, he was referring to Colorado and New Mexico, to end the practice of slavery. This followed a congressional investigation where Vice President Foster and other delegates, including a man by the name of Senator Doolittle from Wisconsin, had come out to New Mexico and done all kinds of interviews and investigations, went back and they were trying to determine the cause of the so-called Indian Wars. They went back and they basically said, it's slavery. There's another slavery going on in the territories. Indigenous people have been captured. This is the cause. We're hearing from people like Manuelito who are being held in Bosque Redondo, that the reason they have felt the wars coming against them is because their children had been taken for generations. All of the Indian agents from New Mexico were silent. People like Felipe Delgado basically wrote a letter and said, this is not slavery. It's part of our custom. He actually framed it in that way. One man, and I argue it's because he had political ambitions, a man who had come from Missouri and settled in Abiquiu initially and then moved on to the San Luis Valley of Southern Colorado. He responded to the call and developed what I believe is one of the most incredible documents of Native American slavery anywhere, and certainly in the United States. This record, which is a list of Indian captives, as it reads, who were acquired by purchase and now live in the service of citizens in Conejos County, Colorado Territory, as taken and rendered by Lafayette Head. And as you see, for those of you who could see, I know some of you in the audience there may not be able to see this up close, but it's a list of columns, rows and columns, the date of the interview, the owner's name, again, his language, the residence, where they lived, the name of the Indian, their age, their tribe, when they were purchased, of whom they were purchased, where they were purchased, whether they were male or female, married, single, whether they were willing to return. I did what you all know how to do so well. I did family trees on both the owner and on the enslaved. I did family trees for each and every one of these individuals and everyone else. I essentially developed what we would call now a relational database. I gathered using family tree software. I needed to understand who were the enslaved, who were the enslavers. I started mining every baptismal record I could find, every census record I could find. I didn't go through every death record or burial record or marriage record, but I did many of them in places that I was especially interested, from Santa Fe all the way north into the San Luis Valley. That database, by the time I would finish it, this was when I was a doctoral student, was about 30,000 individuals of both the enslavers and the enslaved. Let me see if I can move on from here. So some of you will recognize that type of database. It's this one, which is, what is this called? Reunion, I think. I'm a Mac user, so I was using Reunion. And as you see, they're family trees. On the left, you see that this is Padre Antonio Jose Martinez, who had children with Teodora Romero. They had children named Jorge Vicente, but all of these others, Rosario, Soledad, Guadalupe, Manuel Atocha, those were captive indigenous people in that household. So I was trying to understand, well, was it just people like Padre Antonio Martinez? Was it his parents and his siblings? Yeah, the answer was yes. But I also started to do family trees for all of the enslaved. On the right-hand side, you see the family tree for Rosario Romero. She was actually taken with her daughter, Soledad, but then she went on to have other children. There's an image of Rosario. As a trained anthropologist and ethnographer, I was not only gathering documents, but I was gathering stories. I interviewed, I don't know, dozens of her descendants as well. And so that's what I was doing for my doctoral research. And so let me move on to that. Then I mean, I'll just say very briefly, then I became a state historian. I became an administrator of cultural-based institutions for about 20 some odd years. And I put my book aside. I put my dissertation aside and it did all these other things that I'm very proud of. It was a very, no regrets. I loved all the things that I was doing, whether it was as state historian, as executive at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, or as the senior vice president at the trust. But I never let go of this research. For me, it was always important to come back to it. And I did. So when I moved back from DC to New Mexico, I started writing again. And two, I started dreaming of what would this database, if expanded, start to look like. Because before, even though people had come to me when I was state historian and they wanted to look at the database and they would say, well, our ancestor had been captured. We heard stories of a Comanche or Apache. Have you looked at what records do you have? I would often pull that out, but it didn't serve the public if it was just on my computer. I mean, there it is, and there it has remained ever since. But I recognized that there had to be a better way to make this project that had greater potential for the public to actually be able to draw from. And that was where this project was born, in part because I was already running a Mellon Foundation project called the Manitos Community Memory Project that many of you may have seen go up. But as a consequence of the Manito Community Memory Project, I was in conversation with the Andrew Mellon Foundation president and those folks. And one day, because the Elizabeth Alexander, who is the president, she was then the new president of the Mellon Foundation, asked me to serve on two advisory boards, one on monuments and one on advice. She had gathered 9 or so Latino scholars who were advising on what stories would be contained at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Latino. And so in those Zoom calls, which were happening every week, I probably said the phrase Native American slavery half a dozen times. At some point, she asked if I would stay after the official meeting. And she said, "Did you say Native American slavery?" And it's the question I had been waiting for from a major foundation president. And that conversation led to me being invited to submit a proposal to the Mellon Foundation to do this project. A project I had dreamed about for decades by this point. And I wanted to be able to gather a digital repository for every single document to actually tell about our ancestors' story about Native American slavery. And so I want to be able to share that with you today. And so since then, we're a year into the project, we have developed what I now call a constellation of teams. A technical team, a research team, a transcription team. We're actually starting up a translation team, communications engagement team, and all of it has been helped with multiple types of collaborators, scholars, universities, archives, genealogical societies. This image on the left, it's like a whole community has surrounded this project to continue to build on it. Some of you may remember what 20 some odd years ago in 2002, when I was state historian, I launched what was then the Digital History Project, the New Mexico Digital History Project. So I've been working in the digital humanities for decades now. These are just screenshots of what we developed. We literally digitized, I think, 3 million items, records, a lot of Spanish archives of New Mexico. We collected oral histories, we had video, and there were 4 entry points, people, so we had biographies, there were events, there was a map of communities, and then there were stories. So in many ways, this framework has continued to influence me even to this day, as we start to work with programmers to imagine what is the framework that will define what this will look like. So where are we focused? Okay, this is where it gets really crazy. Wait, I want to go back. It's not just New Mexico or the Southwest, it's the entire Western Hemisphere. We are aiming to focus on everything from Alaska and Canada all the way to the tip of Argentina. In fact, yet this past week, I'm working with one of our research assistants, Guillaume Candela, who's a professor at the University of Leeds in the UK, but whose expertise is on the Rio del Plata, who has found probably the first mention and the first sale of an indigenous woman, simply listed as Maria, in Buenos Aires, where she is sold in 1536. And the record is a dispute between 2 men, one who is claiming ownership over her and her daughter, Maria, and one who is claiming paternity of Maria, the child. And so we're focusing on this entire Western Hemisphere. Crazy, I know. When are we focused? This is actually a document, a map-like document that was created under the leadership of Christopher Columbus. I only show it here to as a reminder for me that we're really focused from 1492 all the way to the present. I'll say more about the present later. But 1492, even though indigenous people were capturing other indigenous people, and when we have evidence of that, archaeological or otherwise, we certainly would include that, whether it was prior to 1492 or into the centuries after that. But the empires of Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, the English, the French, and the Americans, not the Americans yet, but all of those other empires, they perfected this. It went from hundreds of people being captured to literally millions of people being captured. And so including that very first voyage that Columbus took and returned, or at least 6 survived, returned 6 indigenous people across the Atlantic to Spain to present as gifts to the Catholic monarchs. That was the first, those individuals were the first individuals that were captured. So that's why we're working from those dates. Okay, who are we focused on? Well, that I think has already been made obvious by the fact that it's Native Americans, indigenous people of the Americas. And so these are obviously photos that I've gathered over time. Let's see, Karen, if there's anyone that is looking for an ancestor here, but I don't see. But these are all individual photos. I've gathered photos of at least 3 or 4 dozens of individuals. Obviously, there weren't photos in the colonial period, but there are photos of people from the 19th century. But this is just an example to show that we're focused on individuals who were captured, taken, and in many cases, in almost all cases, detribalized, taken away from their tribal community and made to serve in a different community. I gathered photos and documents and oral histories, and I love showcasing this one because one, it's from my hometown, but it also speaks volumes, I think, of how we do this work and the challenges of doing this work, but also the opportunities in doing this work. I was interviewing Mrs. Martinez. This was in the late 90s. And they're in the village of Costilla. And she was showing me this photo. Esta gente me dijo, es mi familia, la familia Bernal. This is my Bernal family, she said, pointing out the males that you see on the left and the females lined up on the right. But I asked her, ¿y la otra familia? The other family, I asked her. So if you move your eyes past the center of this photo, all the way back, you're going to see another family in the doorway. So look closely, particularly those of you who are in the there at the library. In the very far back are 3 individuals, a male figure, a female figure, and a little child figure. So when I asked her who is this family, she said, no eran familia, they're not family. Bueno, she paused. They were like family, she said, eran como familia. So I picked up on that word, como familia. What does it mean to be like family and not be family? There's a difference, of course. And in this particular case, because I documented all of these individuals, this was a woman, a Ute woman who had been captured in this family and held years after they should have been freed in the 1860s. This was all the way in the 1880s. And so she was now an adult, had her own family, but she was not really part of the family. And I was curious with this photo, like, did the photographer, what did he think? Did he set this up in this way? Did he ask them to come out of the doorway? Did they accidentally come out of the doorway? What happens here? I don't know. We can only imagine. But this is in the same way that we have to look at the documents. So how are we doing this work? This is the fun, because this past year I've actually been able to, I just finished a report to the Mellon Foundation in which I was able to share with them the amazing amount of work that has been done in one single year. And just a little bit of a shout out. I don't know who all is in the audience, but I know my pal Daria is out there. She is part of this team. And thank you, Daria. You're part of this team who has done all of this heart work. So we created what I call a new cartography, a roadmap, a guide. As Daria knows, I created hundreds of different types of documents, an essay describing who are the indigenous enslaved. These are the people that you all as researchers should be looking for, that really spells out the type of the frame for how we think about Native American slavery. All of this will be made public eventually, but it's all back end right now. I developed how to think about intellectual property, and I started to identify the various types of assets that we would include. There's a document here, the very colorful one on the lower part of this. Really reflects some of Daria's work. And another one of our researchers, Sonia Marquette, who actually, because we started to work with family search, and I've entered into conversations with how we can partner with them. I asked Daria and Sonia to actually give me a broad sense of what records are digitized at Family Search, just the church records. They have more than that, as you all know. But I wanted to understand across the Caribbean, South America, North America, Mexico, Canada, what records are held, baptismal, and so that's what that chart represents. We started to develop an etymology. As those of you who know a lot about Native American slavery know that it was rendered illegal in part in 1542 under the Spanish Empire. Not that it mattered, because it continued to happen, as I say, a tolerated illegality, using the just war clause. But as a consequence, at least in the Southwest, it started to be rare to see the term esclavo after 1542 for Indigenous people. It was rare to see the term slave, but all of these other euphemisms were invented. The term criado, sirviente, peón, all of these other euphemisms. There were also flags, like hijo adoptivo, adopted son or daughter. Now, those were just flags, not necessarily euphemisms, because you could have been adopted and not been a captive Indigenous person. So tons of things like this were developed. And then we started to develop a research team. You see Daria there kind of at the center, looking at the screen, and a bunch of other people and this just represents a sampling of people who started to look online and mine those records. It's people who are actually going into the archive. We have Felisa here, who is in Ecuador at the National Archives in Quito. You have me, I'm at the Benson there in UT Austin. Samuel Cisneros, who some of you will recognize from the Center for Southwest Research. We have Dr. Francis, who's at the University of Southern Florida. He there is actually AGI in Spain. So this represents a fraction of the research team. We also have individuals who started to develop databases of just culling all of this information from any number of sources. We have Alex Peregrino, who is a doctoral student at Vanderbilt, who started to work on from Brazil, and started to work on marriage and baptismal records there. Kathy Ann Dupuy, who started to work with church records in Ontario. We have this at the center. It's actually a spreadsheet based on the 1733 settlement or request for settlement of Genízaros Sandia Pueblo, that I know our friend Lenny Trujillo knows very well, and Daria certainly has done a tremendous amount of work on this after Samuel did the first pass at this. And let's see, even my database is on there, and there must be a few others. So we started developing databases. Those databases probably represent about, 7,000 individuals today. We started working with partners, scholars. Immediately, scholars wrote to me and said, how can we help? I mean, the generosity of individuals has been phenomenal. Many of you know Andres Resendez's book, The Other Slavery. He was one of the very first people to reach out to me and say, Esteban, how can I help? And so Brett Rushforth, who has worked on French records, Nancy Van Dusen, whose interesting book, Global Indios, about those individuals who found themselves in Spain in the 1540s, who after that, the law was passed freeing them, sued for their freedom. So I started building partnerships with archives everywhere, UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso, they've launched a major collaboration with us. Dartmouth, Native American Studies has done the same thing. Here I am at New York Public Library, and so things have just started to emerge. It's been wonderful. We have a transcription team led by Dr. Aaron Taylor, who's here on the left. There's Guillaume Candela in the UK, and Pat Sanchez-Rao, who some of you will recognize, all hard at work doing transcriptions because we're crazy, or I'm crazy, and I bring a wonderful team along with me who believe in the vision that not only are we going to provide the original source, but we're going to fully transcribe those sources. And we're using a couple of methods toward that end. From the Page is a portal that we're using now where people could actually volunteer, sign on, and go through training with Aaron and actually just start to transcribe. I mean, some are very formulaic, as you know. We're transcribing all the baptismal records or marriage records, which are a little bit easier because they're obviously formulaic. For something like SANM or an AGN or an AGI record, Archivo General de las Indias, it's a little bit more challenging because they're whole cases, in some cases, hundreds of pages long. But we have a solid team of paleographers and an incredible team of volunteers. And I don't know if they're part of your society, but I suspect that they are. So I want to give a shout out to Gregory Pizano, Hector Islas, David Moreno, who have just been a phenomenal help in our work to transcribe records. And so we're doing that every day. Here you actually see from the page, folks actually think that it's our web page, what we will actually have. So if you want to just copy that or email us and we'll get that page to you. But Aaron is also, he offers trainings in sacramental records. So in the transcription of sacramental records, and he's available to actually help with that in any way, if anyone is interested. We also began to, we've launched and I've hired a technical team to actually build the project from scratch. We were going to originally build off the shelf, but we are actually building this from scratch. So it's pretty incredible in that way. Daria hasn't even seen half of it, but soon we'll actually be able to showcase this and bring our researchers into the complex webs that we are developing. Some of you have noticed that we've launched a social media campaign even before we actually have the actual website fully developed, because not only will we have a back-end repository, we will have a public-facing free website where you'll be able to look at original records, transcriptions, translations, and everything will be coded. So if we have a Josefa Garcia Apache who is being baptized in one record, and then we have her being mentioned in a last will and testament or in a death record, those records will all be interconnected at the back end, enabling a search. But we've also launched the social media campaign. Follow us at, I think it's at NAT and Native, NAT Bound-Unbound. We're on Twitter, we're on on Facebook and on Instagram. I sound like I'm a commercial, but you can actually look at some of the exciting things that we're exploring. We're not just focused on documents, we're focused on artifacts. We want to gather artifacts that were held by the enslaved. We're looking at maps, we're looking at artwork, we're doing all kinds of things. Why are we doing this? Why? It's my favorite part of the question. the project will be available to scholars to advance new forms of scholarship. It will be available to educators. In fact, we maybe a phase 2 or a phase 3 will actually build curriculum from this. It'll be available to storytellers, artists. Already, I'm already working with a dance troupe in Santa Fe and in San Francisco to be able to draw from this material that they want to develop a choreographed dance to. When the president of the Mellon Foundation said, "Who are you building this for?" For me, the answer was unequivocal. We are building this for descendant communities, descendants to be able to trace their ancestors, to reconnect themselves. You know, one of the caste categories that we often see of our ancestors is colores quebrados, right? Broken colors. I think I'm drawn to that caste because I can think, I want to say, on the one hand, how can they have been labeled broken? How can a person be broken? But they were. Slavery broke apart so much. It severed their connections to their homelands, to their ancestry, to their worldviews. And I like to think that what we are doing is restorative, but putting our pieces back together again. So even though this project and this site will be available to everyone because it's going to be online, it's done really for descendants. And so I will end there. Let me stop sharing if I might. And let's see, there's a couple of questions here. I know I got it right on time, Karen. So I can talk forever, as you can imagine, but I'm available for questions if we have time for them.
Okay, I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, yeah, this is Mona. You mentioned something about part of our custom, and it was not considered slavery. You said the man who said that was Felipe Delgado?
I believe it was one of the Indian agents, and I believe it was Felipe Delgado. There were two of them, and he wrote a letter in response to Andrew Johnson's request to end the practice of slaving, and he used the term, "It's not slavery, it's custom."
Okay, I have one more question. Now, in 1776, there was a Comanche attack that took place at La Cienega, Cienega, Las Golondrinas. And there were two boys that were taken captive. And in my research, I never did find these two boys again, but given the fact that this happened in 1776, I'm likely not going to be able to find them. Is that correct?
You know, well, it's actually a really good question. Chances are against us in finding them again, right? It depends on who they were taken captive by, and I don't remember this exact case. I know that these captivities were taking place, and if I remember, that was a Comanche attack. Is that correct?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there was a 10-year period, I think, from 1767 to 1777, where the Comanches were striking left and right. And so in 1776, in June, they had struck there at La Cienega, and they had killed 9 individuals, and they took 2 boys captive. And in my research, I've never been able to find those 2 boys again.
To find them. Well, as you know, the attack also happened, an attack happened also in Taos. And some of those individuals, as we know, Villalpando was an ancestor for a lot of people, and some of those records have been found. As I started to say, so, you know, it's challenging to actually find these individuals who were taken captive, particularly when we're dealing with communities like the Comanches, who in some cases, not all cases, were not keeping records in the same way that the Spanish were. And so, and that's not true of all indigenous peoples, but if I remember correct, this was certainly true of the Comanches. So finding them is challenging, if not impossible. But at the same time, here's what is promising about this project, that we are gathering all of that material, we're coding it. And if we say we find something from research that we're doing in the Comanche Nation, and that there's an oral history that is told, that is gathered, say, in the 1930s, that mentions people that were taken from New Mexico, right? It's entirely possible that we might be able to find something. But again, you have done a lot of the research already. If you've not found them, it may be harder to actually find.
Yeah, because that happened so far back.
Yeah.
Hi, Esteban. This is Cynthia Rodriguez, and I enjoyed your presentation greatly. I'm kind of familiar with it because I had Aaron Taylor come out on a podcast of mine and talk about this very program. So I was very happy to have him last year. The question I have is in regards to an ancestor of mine that we researched and found out she is from the a tribe up in Wisconsin, Menominee tribe. And she somehow made her way down to Texas, where some of my other ancestors met up with her and I guess married her and brought her into the Mexican family that we have. Would I be able to go in your program right now and look her up and see if there's anything on her? I'm doing research and I'm actually doing a book on her.
Unfortunately not. We just started. So I mean, we have tons of records, but none of it is public yet, right? We probably will not have a public facing website that's tied to the repository for at least another year. So what I'm talking about is a project that is in progress and that holds the promise of someone like you looking in the future. But of course, you're interested in finding it right now for the book. But unfortunately, we don't have that information available public.
Okay, I'll just keep hitting ancestry. Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you for coming.
Anyone else in the room have a question?
Has he thought about contacting NGS? They'd be fascinated by this, the National Genealogical Society.
We have not, thank you for the question, whether I've thought about contacting. I've thought about contacting everyone, but I've not contacted NGS. No, I have not.
They love this, I'm sure.
Kathy,
It would have been great to hear this last May.
yeah, just talk. We have a question from Cheryl Wolf.
So I'm interested in migration patterns, and I'm wondering if it's come up in your research, if anyone is creating a software package or working on migration patterns at all.
It's a very good question. In fact, when I was talking, I'm sure that there's software for this. That I may not know of, and I'm not the person to actually respond to the question. But what I can say is that when even this past week, when I was meeting with the programmers and we're starting to meet with our web developer, I said, again, you'll remember my framework for how I want to showcase all of this data is time, people, place, and story. So place, as I was having that conversation with them, I said, it's not just about maps, or it's not just about architecture, because I'm interested in what I call the architecture of slavery and the geography of slavery, but it's about migrations, I said. So for instance, there were people who are being named, and some are just listed as numbers, who are in all of those records that are of people moving up and down the Camino Real, right? That are being traded either down into Mexico or along the entire Camino. In the same way, we see the old Spanish Trail. I mean, those of you who are connected to New Mexico, you know that the same is true about the old Santa Fe Trail, that people were being traded along, captured and traded along that route. And so not only are we the include those individuals in the database, but when we actually visualize that on the website, I was telling the programmers, I want to be able to show migration routes. So you're ahead of me, though.
It's great.
I have a question. Since the Catholic Church finds the Indians to be innocent or naive in regards to able to be converted and also baptized into the faith, did most of the records you find are of this nature, or are they basically the influence in regards to showing them as slaves at this point in time?
Well, in a way, it's such an interesting question. There, you know, it goes to the question that the issue that I raised when I was talking about the euphemisms. So as we're looking at these baptismal records, for instance, we are looking for what the record actually says. I mean, and they say all kinds of things, as Daria will attest. Looking at these, you all know this, right? When you're looking at those baptismal records, it will actually list terms like del Nación del Norte, Apache, en el servicio de, or they'll connote some level of ownership using the word de. So they're for us, we read those as all about slavery at some level, right? But the reason I preface this as saying it's an interesting question because we have stumbled upon group baptisms. At Isleta and at Hemis that take place, where was that, Daria? I think it was the 1740s.
Yeah.
1740s, and so they're interesting because they're group baptisms of Moqui people, Hopi people, who are being brought into these other villages, and so we started a conversation. Do we count those in our database? Right, there are like hundreds of them, and we've grappled over it, and we continue to grapple over it, but like it really speaks, because they use the term, if I remember correct, neophyte, right, to your question. So it really speaks to this notion that they are innocent, right? Or they're not, neophyte means more than innocent, but it's referring really to a way in which they may not end up as enslaved captive people, but are there of their own accord. We don't know yet. And in fact, that's where we're leaning, because there's no sign necessarily that they're in any way captive. But almost every other record around those records actually does point to some form of bondage. It's a very complicated question that you've asked, but I could give a whole lecture on that.
I do know that the Catholic Church felt that people from Africa were Muslims, so they weren't able to be converted at that point in time. So they treated them separately compared to the Indians, even though the Indians were enslaved at that point. And then afterwards, the Catholic Church says, hey, you can't enslave these people. But, you know, that continued on, like you said, in 1880.
That happened, yes, it's true. 1540, you have the Pope decreeing thanks to Bartolome de las Casas, who actually argues with himself and argues basically that we cannot capture indigenous people. I mean, a whole Congress of debate of the popes, the clerics, philosophers gathered, and legal philosophers gathered to debate whether you could enslave indigenous people. And in the end, Bartolome de las Casas flipped from arguing for indigenous people being enslaved to against it. And that's where you started to have more African people enslaved. But it switches, and it really doesn't matter after 1540, because there's three ways in which people could still be justified, their enslavement could still be justified. Probably the most prominent of that was the just war clause. So if you captured someone in a quote just war, so let me give you the 1598 example of here in New Mexico. When the Acoma Pueblo was massacred, what was debated the day before the massacre happened was if we capture them and hold them in slavery, is it a just war? And the clerics told Oñate, yes, it is. And they use that as a way to justify their enslavement. But again, this is a complicated matter. I care more about, were they taken away from their families? Were they made to serve in a different family? It doesn't matter the legal debates around this. I care more about what is the experience of individuals.
I have a question from Rose Crawford in the chat. She says, in your research, are you tracking the children that were taken and put into schools with the idea of civilizing them?
It's such a good question, Rose. In terms of, you're talking about the Native American boarding schools largely, which is a phenomenon that really happens in the 19th century. And, at this point, we're not necessarily including boarding schools in the same way, but one could make an argument very easily that it's a form of bondage. We just haven't made that argument yet. But what I have done is I've started to develop a spreadsheet of all of the individuals. I'm looking primarily, I started looking, this was several years ago, at people who are being taken from, quote, Hispanic villages that were not recognized by the federal government as tribal, including places like Abiquiu, in Santa Fe and Belen, people who are being taken from those villages and being sent to places like Carlisle, Fort Lewis. My grandfather, who was from Cuesta, was sent to Fort Lewis Indian School in Durango, Colorado. So what I'm interested in is, why are they being sent? And why wasn't everyone being sent? Like, what are the differences? And my hypothesis, which hasn't been fully tested, is that those individuals being sent, they're being sent for a reason that they could have a father, mother, grandparent who were themselves captured and enslaved indigenous people. And that's bearing out in some cases and not in others. So I'm testing my hypothesis, but a very good question.
Well, we're coming to the end of the Q&A, but did you have a question, Karen?
Yes, I do. Esteban, in my family, I've just got these tantalizing, very short stories, and nothing that's fully fleshed out. Like, for example, I have on two different sides of the family, they say a particular ancestor that her mother was a full-blooded Indian. They'd say she was Indian. And then I look at the records, and the baptismal records doesn't say anything about it. So I've kind of given up. Is it worth trying to still search to see who their ancestors really were?
Yes.
Their native ancestors.
It absolutely is worth it. I mean, as you all know with these things, I think you refer to them as adobe walls, right? We end up there at that wall.
Mhm.
And sometimes it doesn't match the story, right? So oftentimes it doesn't. But think about like the way we think of this data, ethnographic, remember the phone game? someone tells a story and by the end of the, the line, the story has changed dramatically. Place that phone game into a generational landscape where people are sharing these stories across generations. So the two stories that I started with, Lainia Panana and the Dene woman, they were not where the story had them in the generation. They ended up in a very different place. And in fact, one I still haven't fully found. And so but it's still worth looking, right? Because, sometimes the memories and the stories place them in the third or fourth generation up, but they could be in a completely different line 7 generations back. And so the story changes, but it's worth actually continuing to pull back the layers of these documents. And again, at some future time, I hope our project facilitates that, right? So that you could just go in there and actually type up these names and see like, oh, that must be my Maria, or that must be whatever, right? So you get the idea.
Thank you.
You're
Oh, you know
welcome.
what I was gonna say? This is Mona again. I have a story like that too, where my grandmother supposedly had an older half sister who was supposed to be indigenous. But to make a long story short, it turned out she was actually, I think, born out of wedlock, and she ended up being raised in the family. So somehow that story came in and it turned out it wasn't true.
Yeah, so here's Cynthia. I think that maybe DNA would help. What do you think?
In that case, yeah.
In any case that you're looking for your ancestors, Native American, especially family tree DNA, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Karen, would you like to?
Yes, Esteban, I want to thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. And I know that it's engendered, I'm excited about what you're doing. And I hope that I'm sure everybody else is too. We look forward to hearing about your further progress as, in the upcoming years. And I thank you again for the privilege of your speaking to us.
Yeah,
You have all honored me. The privilege is mine. Thank you.
Keep in touch with you, Esteban.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I will let you all get to your business meeting. And so I wish you all well. And if anyone wants to participate in the project, sign them up there, Daria. And and if I can't seem to share my email on here because something is quirky on here, but I'm going to send it to you, Karen. But please feel free to share that with everyone.
I have it. Can I just put it, is it all right with you if I just put it in the chat now?
By all means, by all
Great,
means.
I will do that.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Be well, everyone.